Hello, today we're back into making stuff with a quarter sheet pan and a riser. You can do this on a like a 9 by 10 baking pan, but this is the simplest thing, and I've told you before you should go out and buy one. I still think that's the case. We're going to make baklava, which is a Greek dessert, and we're going to make Spanakopita, which is like a Greek dinner. So the first thing we're going to do, because when you do work with phyllo dough, you want to have every layer of phyllo dough brushed with butter. And so we're going to put our butter in a saucepan to start to melt while we get other things going. This is a pound of butter, and that'll be enough to do the 2 quarter sheet pans. If I were doing a full sheet pan or a half sheet pan, then I'd use a pound of butter on the whole thing. But this way you can get both your dinner Spanakopita and your dessert out of 1 pound of butter. Now the Spanakopita is layers of phyllo dough, and in the middle there's an onion, garlic, spinach, cheesy layer, and then you've got more layers on top of that, and then a crust. And so what we're doing is we're going to chop onions and saute them with some garlic, and then we're going to mix the onions, spinach, kale, and cheese together. And so let's start by chopping up the onion and garlic. You can use as much onion as you want. I'm figuring about a half of a good size onion for this dish. Then I finely chop it. Turn on our heat. Okay, we're going to use a little bit of olive oil to saute our onion. That's pretty much all the olive oil we'll be using. Now, whenever you saute something, it's going to really go down in size. So when you look at that, you go, ooh, is that enough onions for what I like? If I'm an onion eater, I'd say maybe I need a little bit more onions, which I'm going to do, because I've got another half an onion. You can definitely decide, oh, I don't really like onions, but this dish really does well with all those flavors. So we put in a whole onion. Now we'll put in about 2 or 3 cloves of garlic. It's a nice sized garlic. We have some great garlic here at the co-op. Okay, there's onions and garlic. You want to put in a little salt to start with, just a wee bit. I believe the pepper will go in there and the dill too, so we'll take those out. And there's one secret ingredient, nutmeg. Nutmeg is really great in this recipe. You want to be able to taste a little bit of nutmeg, but not too much. But in the case of our starting here, the nutmeg goes into when we stir up the ingredients. Now this is a dish that has cheese, eggs, the sauteed onions and garlic, some spices in the middle layer. I always use feta cheese. My mom made even better Spanakopita and she'd usually use 3/4 cottage cheese to 1/4 feta cheese. It was good. It was great. But I'm like, I want to use feta cheese, so I use feta cheese. So what we'll do is we'll put on gloves because the feta cheese is kind of sticks to your fingers. Now I'm using the Odyssey feta. It's a really great tasting feta. It'll give it the tang that I like to have. The Organic Valley natural feta is really great. I like this Odyssey feta better. Okay, so we've got our crumbled up feta cheese. Now we're going to put in some egg. We need 2 eggs. The egg part is the binder. That's what keeps our middle layer in this dish going nicely. Okay. Now you can kind of stir that up to get it kind of mixed up to begin with. I'm going to set this aside and start working on my spinach. So while that's cooking, I'm going to cut up the spinach and kale. We have some really great looking spinach here at the co-op. I would have normally used all spinach. You could use frozen spinach, chopped frozen spinach, unchopped frozen spinach. I kind of like using fresh spinach better, but the chopped versions do just fine. Like I said, that my mom made really good Spanakopita, and she always used chopped frozen spinach. Sometimes we made a mistake and got unchopped frozen spinach, and it was a chore, but it was good. So I'm going to chop the spinach up into small pieces. Now sometimes you could do is you could saute the spinach or steam it, chop it and steam it before you put it in the baklava, or not baklava, the Spanakopita. But I found that I like it this way. And you'll use more, you use a lot. It'll be a lot of green with a little bit of other stuff in it. And that's because all this spinach and kale will work down in the heat. And if you used less and you're thinking you were using the right amount, or use less than I'm using, then it'll come out to be more cheesy looking than spinachy looking. I can hear the butter is almost melted. So I'm going to turn the heat off. All we want to have is melted butter. Sometimes you have to reheat it a little bit because it'll cool off and harden. But I don't think in the amount of time we have here that it'll do that. Then you can see our onions are now cooking away. We want to caramelize them. The more you can caramelize them, the better. It'll give you that nice onion garlic flavor that you like, I like. Next is dino kale. You can really use any kind of kale in chard. I've used dino kale before and I couldn't tell the difference between that and spinach. So you could use all kale if you wanted to. You could use all spinach. You could use all chard. So you can see that I'm cutting it into really thin strips. I like using the dino kale because it really ends up looking a lot like the spinach. Then I'll cut it again. Now, my recipe calls for 2 pounds of spinach, so I have used 1/2 pound of spinach, and I'm going to use about 1/2 pound of kale, so that would equal 2 pounds. My recipe is for a full half sheet. I'm using a 1/4 sheet, so I'm cutting it down a little bit. Okay, we're going to mix it up and see how we like it. You can see all that feta cheese in there. That looks like it's going to have a nice yummy layer of stuff. Okay, we need to have our measuring spoons. Measuring spoons, where are you? Here's the teaspoon, and so now we're going to follow our recipe with dill, nutmeg. I guess we're going to put some Parmesan cheese in it too. So here's dill. Dill is 1/2 teaspoon. So this is a 1 teaspoon, so it's 1/2 of that. There we go. And then we're going to put in nutmeg, which is calling for 1/4 teaspoon. So we just do the end part. Catch that? Okay. And then we'll put in a little bit more salt. And Parmesan, we need about 1/2 cup of Parmesan. 1/4 cup of Parmesan, I'm sorry. I'm taking a recipe and dividing it in half in my head. It usually is much better when you divide it on the paper. So I've just put in the nutmeg, you can see it in there. The dill is in there. Now about 1/2 cup of Parmesan. We're gonna, my onions are caramel, see how they're nicely caramelizing? We're close. Okay. Stir this up. See how it's mostly green? That's perfect. It'll cook down. Remember, I said that if you don't have feta cheese, you can use cottage cheese. Okay, that's all nicely mixed. And the onions and garlic are, now that's a nice caramelization right there. So I'm going to throw them in hot. Stir that around. And now we're going to put that to the side because we're going to start doing the phyllo dough with it. We'll turn off our burners. We don't need those anymore. Okay. This parchment paper is for a half sheet pan. You see the difference? You can see it either way? Okay. So the phyllo dough will fit really nice on this half sheet. I used to put a parchment sheet on the bottom, but I found that what would happen is that the baklava or spanakopita would stick to the parchment. And one of the processes of making spanakopita and baklava is the cutting process. And sometimes this parchment paper would cut, and then it would be on the bottom of the product, and then you'd have to peel it away, and that got to be difficult. I found that it works just fine to do it in the pan. This has always worked pretty good. A lot of people tell you that you have to cover your phyllo dough while you're making your baklava. And I'm here to tell you that after making baklava and spanakopita for about 10 years fairly constantly, what the problem was is what phyllo dough you were purchasing. If you were purchasing it from a grocery store that often their freezer was producing frost, and phyllo dough is one of those products that don't sell very long, then it dries out in the freezer if there's frost present. So what you want to look at when you go to the store to buy phyllo pastry is there frozen ice along the edges of some of the doors? If there is, you know that they have a problem with their freezer. Not a big problem, but for phyllo dough, that's what makes it more difficult to work with. So it comes in a plastic sheath, and you just take it off the plastic sheath, and then there's a plastic wrap that goes around it. Find the edges. There we go. We're going to use half of this phyllo dough in this pan and half of it for another one, the baklava. So we're going to start with the Spanakopita. Now you can do this two different ways. I found that I like the way I'm going to show you better. Both of them will work. You can take the phyllo pastry single sheets. See how thin they are? And you could lay them in your pan, butter that side, and then fold over this side. I find that to be a little bit too cumbersome. So what I do is I put my pan next to it, I eyeball the half, and I cut it in half. There we go, half done. Now let's see, I can find another pan. With some more parchment paper, and I'll store half of this away. Maybe I want to put a towel over it too, because it'll be a little while before we get to the next one. So there we go. That's for the baklava. This is for the Spanakopita. I'm going to pour the butter out into a small pan. And I have tried different ways of doing this. If I were to do this commercially, I would try and figure out a sprayer. But right now this seems to work out pretty good. A brush, a silicone brush. So what you want to do is, you don't have to count the layers, but I believe there's about 20. So the first 10 layers are phyllo dough, butter, phyllo dough, butter, phyllo dough, butter. We'll do that. So I drop it into the pan. And then I brush the butter on top. A bristle brush, natural bristle brush, or nylon bristle brush. This process doesn't work so good, and you eventually get the bristles coming out of the brush. So this is number 2. Notice how I don't worry too much about the edges. So another layer of butter. This is number 3. You guys can count along with me if you want, so I don't get lost. So you want to use half your sheets in your pan. Now comes putting in the egg spinach mixture, and you'll say, ooh, that's pretty thick. Well, you want this as dinner, you don't want it as anything else. Oops, I'm spilling a little bit. Make sure you get yourself some nice rubber spatulas. This is, like I've said before, is one of my favorite. I have worked in a number of commercial kitchens, and it always gives me angst when I see someone throw away even a little bit of this stuff, or any kind of thing. So you want to scrape it down to the point where you almost don't need to wash it. Okay, now let's spread this dough out a little bit more. Okay, we're going to put on a next layer of phyllo dough. And this is what I learned not too long ago. Put your phyllo dough on there, and then take your spatula and press it in. We'll do this with this baklava too. Just press down that filling. Gets it nice and even, ready for the next layers. Some more butter. And the rest of the phyllo dough will go on top. last one, I think. Sometimes it's hard to tell, but yep, that's the last one. I have made this by alternating two sheets of phyllo dough with butter instead of one every single time. It works, but I think that this ends up having a more crispy product and tender tasting. I haven't tried oil or margarine or anything like that. Figure with butter, you get a nice butter. I'm using an organic butter. Okay, so this is your assembled Spanakopita. Now what you want to do, and this is the real trick of this whole situation, because you'll want to cut it up into however many bite-sized pieces you like. You can cut them up very small, you can cut them up large. If you try and cut them up now, it'll just wreck it. It'll move everything around because that butter is liquidy all the way through. So the first thing you do is put it in the refrigerator for about an hour to overnight. Now we're going on to baklava. We've taken one package of phyllo dough and we've made a quarter sheet of Spanakopita. Now we're going to make a quarter sheet of baklava. So we put a pan. The very first thing to do is get some water boiling and honey. And since we're doing a quarter pan, it's a cup and a half of water, 2 cups of honey, we want to save a little bit of the honey for putting in with our walnuts. And here's some cardamom pods and cinnamon sticks. Stick those in too. We're going to use 4 tablespoons of lemon juice. No, I'm sorry, I keep on forgetting I'm dividing everything in half. 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, which is 6 teaspoons. Now you don't have to do this right away because you're going to let your baklava sit overnight, and you're not pouring the liquid from this sauce over the baklava until it's come out of the oven and it's warm. So you can do this after the whole process or before. I'm going to do it before. So now we just set that aside and we're going to wait for that to start boiling and then turn it down as we need to. Now we need to make our filling. We have our food processor here. This works a lot easier with a food processor. You can make the filling out of any kind of nuts you like. I haven't made it out of sunflower seeds, but I'm sure that would be okay. You can make it out of walnuts. I'm making it out of walnuts. They're easy to work with and they're not that expensive. Okay, so we want 1 pound of walnuts. This is 1 pound of walnuts. We're going to put it in our food processor. And then we'll give it a brief chop. Now we're going to put in a quarter cup of honey, a teaspoon of cardamom, and a teaspoon of cinnamon. And we have those over here. So for the sauce that we pour over the baklava, it's cardamom pods and cinnamon sticks, which will boil and release their flavor. For inside the filling, we're going to use ground cinnamon and ground cardamom. So we need a teaspoon of each. And then we put back on the top and mix it. Then we're looking for a quarter cup of honey. That's about a quarter cup. I put it at the end because it tends to clump up whatever you're putting it in with. It'll clump up the material. So I like putting it in at the very end. This dish I've seen made with sugar. You can make it with sugar. It works, but it does not give it an authentic taste. You can make it half honey, half sugar, but I don't see the purpose of doing that. I like honey. This should have a nice honey taste. You should be able to taste the cinnamon and the cardamom. If you can't, then you haven't added enough. Okay, so that's mixed up. Again, you have a riser on a quarter sheet pan. Now we bring out our phyllo dough that we had from the other one. And as you can see that this is not dried out, it's easy to still work with. So, again, the process is sheet of phyllo dough, butter, see how I just dab it in there? For the first sheet especially, I just dab it in there so you can get the second sheet to adhere. Okie doke. Now we're going to drop our walnuts mixture, walnuts and spice and honey, onto our baklava, or onto our fillo pastry. So you want to evenly push this in all directions. There you go. And then another sheet of phyllo dough. And of course I used my trusty spatula here, so I have to clean it off for the next step. Okay, butter. I hope I'm going to have enough butter. I like it when recipes come out even, like not a pound and a quarter, it's not a pound and an eighth, but it's like just something you would have, a pound of butter. And so I always make sure that this recipe, 2 quarter sheets, will use a pound of butter. And if you're just a little bit off, if you're putting on a little bit too much butter per sheet, you can get that off. I mean, you can use more butter than you need to. So you could theoretically put chopped nuts on the top and make it pretty, but I'd stay away from that. So I just have a little bit of butter left. Made it through the whole thing. Yay, yay. Okay, now this one is going to go into the cooler and chill down. We're back again. This has taken about an hour and a half to chill down the Spanakopita and the baklava And you can see when I press on it that it is nice and solid. That means the butter has gotten solid all the way through, or most of the way through. These are quarter sheet pans, and I just love using them. Other people that have them, Serena loves using them, so I'm going to say get yourself some quarter sheet pans. Don't get jelly roll pans. Jelly roll pans are a different size, and then people complain that they can't find anything that fits it. They don't realize they've just bought a jelly roll pan. So get yourself a good quarter sheet pan and some half sheet pans and some risers. So this is the knife I'm going to use to cut the baklava and the spanakopita with. It's a Russell Dexter paring knife. Really a nice knife. Julia got it for cutting her vegetables, so she'd probably be upset if she saw me cutting this stuff with her. So baklava is cut into triangles. So you can see I just cut it into 3s, and now I'll cut it into 4s. So they're almost squares. And see how that's cut really nice? Now here's the part of the trick, is now you'll want to cut it into your triangles. If the butter wasn't hard enough, I would have lifted up every single one of those and would have had a mess on my hands. And see, it just started happening here. But we can get it done. We can do it. Then the 2 corners. So you see each one of these is a triangle. That's what I consider to be a perfect size for eating. We're going to put them in the oven for about 40 minutes at 350. Now we're going to do the spanakopita. I like spanakopita, and preferably I'd like it on my plate. A nice big piece of spanakopita with maybe some garlic mashed potatoes or some scordalia, which is a Greek mashed potatoes. So in this case, I would cut it in half. See, I can't decide, do I cut it into quarters, which would make 8 pieces out of a small tray, or do I cut it into thirds, which makes 6 pieces? Well, since we're serving it in our case, our refrigerator case, I'll cut it into 8 pieces. Those are nice for a simple lunch. So you see that's cut into 8 pieces. It cut really nicely. If it hadn't been chilled enough, that filling would have popped up and made a mess. We like to have the edges like this. Now both are in the oven at 350 for about 40 minutes. Now what we're going to be looking for, we'll come back to it in a little while, in about 35 minutes, and we'll pull them out, and we're going to look for color. That's what's really critical with baklava and spanakopita, is you want to have a nice crispy top, so you want your color to be there. And after a while you get used to what the color would be at the bottom of the baklava. You want that to be well cooked too. So if it's cooked well on the top, it's usually cooked well on the bottom. Okay, and that's it for today. I'm going to be taking a break for about 2 months, and there's a lot of ideas floating around about other videos to do, and I'm excited to hear what they're going to be. So keep in tune. You'll get new videos every week. And you can also email us or tell someone in the store what you would like to see. So until later, this is Cooking with Miller. Pretty soon I'll be cooking with everyone. Okay, bye-bye.